everyone, welcome. Today it is a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Andrew Chien. I'm just going to read some of his many accomplishments. He's the William Eckhart Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago. He's also the director of CRES, Center for Unstoppable Computing. That makes sense.
It's actually
Ceres.
It's actually Ceres, like the Roman gods, goddess Ceres.
He's a senior fellow at the Computation Institute, senior computer scientist at Argonne National Laboratory. He's been vice president of research at Intel. He's been the endowed chair professor for SAIC at the University of California, San Diego. And he's an entrepreneur. He was the CTO and founder of Entropia. And I've known Andrew. I followed his work since I was a grad student. And just on a personal note, he is one of the strongest and most important members of the scientific community with whom I've had the pleasure to work.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you for those kind words. It's a pleasure to be here. And if I can live up to half the things that Rich said, I'll be happy. So I'm going to give, so first I should say, the work I'm going to talk about today is actually joint with a number of folks. Fan Yang, who's a graduate student of mine at Chicago, Rich, who's here at UC Santa Barbara, and Victor Zavala and Kibet Kim, who are at Argonne. But it's, Rich encouraged me to give kind of a radical talk, right? Something that we're in the early stages of doing, but the kind of work that I came back to the university to do. I left a wonderful position at Intel because I wasn't having enough personal fun, and there were a lot of things that I thought that could be done to maybe change the world that were hard to do inside a corporate setting. So you guys should be really happy about being where you are and not be too eager to run off to startups or big companies or what have you, because I think being a professor and being a graduate student is a tremendously fun job. So you're probably wondering, what is stranded power? So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about trying to understand that at a technical level, what it actually is. And then I'll talk about some different ideas we've been developing to exploit stranded power and try to project a little bit as to where one might go from here and what the world might look like in 10 or 20 years. So we all have energy on the brain, right? Everyone's worried about energy efficiency because here I am at the Institute for Energy Efficiency. And people in the computing community have been thinking for a long time about how to do maybe rack level or data center level power management, power efficiency, all very important, good work. And then recently it's become popular for people to think about whole data centers and think about PUE, right? If you know what that means. Think about cooling and all of the other stuff that goes along with making computing efficient. Today I'm going to ask you to think a little bit outside the box, literally, and think about this picture of energy efficiency, where you think not only about the data center, but also think about transmission and think about generation. And the notion here is that you can think about energy efficiency from the point at which the energy becomes organized, right, as power, electrical power that can be exploited in many ways. And we really ought to be thinking about this whole big picture as an addition to the other great things that are going on. So if you start to look at power grids as systems, you quickly discover that there's a phenomena that we call stranded power. I think the power grid people call it down dispatch or curtailment or economic dispatch or what have you. But the basic idea is, despite the fact that these grids are now being scheduled by fairly sophisticated markets, that these economic management mechanisms can disproportionately cause renewable power to be stranded. That means discarded, wasted, thrown away. And there's a lot of technical reasons for this. But the purpose of this graph is to show you that over a period of about a year in the MISO power grid, which is the mid-continent power grid that runs from Saskatchewan all the way down to Louisiana. It's about 14 states, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The economic mechanisms wasted 2.2 terawatt hours of wind in 2014. And if you were to talk to the power grid folks, they would say, that's a terrific success. Because they look at that and they say, we allocated efficiently 98% of the power, right? So it's a glass half full, half empty kind of situation. And our idea is to try and find ways to actually exploit this stranded power, right? Because if you average that power over the entire year, it's about 250 megawatts sustained, right? It's a fair amount of power, and you could do some useful stuff with that. So in order to do that, first let's spend a few minutes talking about what does that actually look like? What does that stranded power actually look like? Well, this is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, right? This is the area that it covers, and they have this very cool online real-time map that you can look at if you want. The crosses correspond to generation sites, and the color scheme actually corresponds to pricing. right? And I'm not going to try and explain the color scheme. It changes all the time anyway. But suffice it to say, I picked this example carefully to give some examples of negative pricing, and this purple actually corresponds to negative pricing. But this is really one of the largest power grids in the world, 15 states, 130 gigawatts peak load. It's probably about twice the size of the California Independent System Operator just in total magnitude. They transact a lot of power, $37 billion in 2014, a lot of transmission. And this is interesting. There's about $2.2 billion in transmission charges versus $37 billion in power charges, to give you a sense of scale. And right now, this independent system operator is about 10% wind. And the NREL projected wind power plan would take this wind generation over 50% by 2035, I think is the year. So a radical increase. So what's been going on? Well, the reason this is an interesting problem is there's been a radical transformation of the power industry and the power grid over the past 40 years. So if you look at the power grid in 1975, you had largely vertically integrated providers. They own generation, they own transmission, they own customers, right? They had a few large fixed generation sites and a few large loads, right? Think Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and then big industrial plants and so on. And they were geographically fixed, and they had 2x sort of dynamic range, cyclic, up and down, over the days like you've seen, right? Central control, right? They centrally controlled these things. The power grid in 2015 is already quite different, and it's trending more in this direction. Now you have economically and corporate structure-wise separation of generation and distribution. So these ISOs, these power grids, are independent entities run, in order to match up essentially generators and loads. There's an explosion in large-scale distributed renewable generation, right? Every solar farm, every wind power farm, potentially owned by a different entity. Of course, some of them are owned by the same entity, but, at least different from the centrally owned kind of a thing. You have highly variable generators, depending on sun, wind, what have you. And the loads, well, more or less the same, because a lot of conservation has gone on. They actually haven't grown a lot. It's quite interesting. And so you move from a centralized control world into a world in which you have economic dispatch, an open market, and localized pricing, right? Said a different way, right? We have a bunch of generators that are producing capability and price information, and then this market is supposed to fairly decide across, feasible schedules, of course, cheapest, greenest, fair, right? They're not supposed to discriminate against different providers, and they have to do this fast, right? So in the MISO operator, they allocate in 5-minute increments, and then they do 40-second adjusts, if you can believe that. And they have to do it reliably, and they have to deliver it to folks as much as they want. Sort of true, right? If you're a big industrial customer, you can't just instantaneously demand 10 megawatts, right? But generally speaking, this is the model, right, that they're delivering to their customers. So it's pretty hard to do this, actually. So technically what's going on, the generators bid an eco max and eco min. That means economic max, economic min, and price curves, right, for how these things hourly. And then you have some complicated economic allocation based on global optimization focused on merit order. Merit order means cheapest first, basically. And there's a day-ahead market, there's a real-time market, there's futures, there's all kinds of things, right? The control, as I said, is, it's 5-minute dispatch. I'm sorry, it's not 40 seconds, it's 4 seconds. Adjustments. And then after all this happens, payment is based on logging of what actually got done, right? Yeah.
I'm curious about this control and variability. So
Yep.
are things changing that fast in terms of the generation of the
You mean the 4 seconds? I think that there's substantial uncertainties in the behavior of the system, right? So, even a transmission line, right, changes its behavior based on things like temperature, perhaps wind stretching it or other kinds of things. Some of the generators will have fluctuation. There is gusting into wind farms, right, which has some effect on their productivity and so on. So there is and then, of course, the load, right, as we talked about. Loads choose sort of asynchronously when they want to vary stuff. So they're responding to that as well. They have a forecast. The forecast is not 100% accurate, right?
The load has been changing since the 70s.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to figure out what's new.
Yeah.
That we are relying on wind and
Well, there are some parts of the load that are changing in ways that are much more difficult to manage these days. And we had an ad up for the power utility person. So not to sound like a power utility person for a minute, but net metering, right, fundamentally changes the load dynamic, right, for the residential areas, right? So some things have changed on the load side. Yep. Okay. So what's going on is, this is a little bit redundant. We have generation offered. We have transmission constraints. We have a market, right, that takes all those things and based on that produces a schedule and prices, right? And the interesting thing is, it's really hard actually to understand how these things are produced because it's a complex technical allocation problem. And on top of that, there's a complex market mechanism running, right? And that produces, it turns out, wide variation at the edges, right, at the generators. And there's this term that I'll use again and again called locational marginal pricing, which is the way they allocate pricing and costs, right, to these different centers. But it's basically the market price that the generator sees that's decided by this ISO. Okay, so if I'm living at the edge, right, so all that complicated stuff happening at the middle, I go and borrow money from my banker and I build a bunch of wind turbines. I live on feast and famine, right? So I have variable generation and I have price fluctuations, right? And my goal is to make money on average, right? So I want a good average price when I'm able to supply power. So to give you a sense of how much fluctuation there is, right, this is not a single site, but this is price history versus hour of the day for December 2011 at the Minnesota hub. This is a bunch of wind generation coming into a single hub. And you can see that the prices vary all over the place. They could be as high as $100, and I'll show you much higher prices in a minute, or they could be as low as, in this case, minus $50, and these are in units of megawatt hours, right? Okay, so there's a big swing. I think actually it's different days, right? I think it trended through different days, but the detail's not that important. I'm going to show you more things. The main thing is to show you that there is this fluctuation, right? And this isn't just a 2011 thing. As recently as the July 4th weekend in the MISO region, it turned out that the 4th of July, a lot of companies shut down their factories and so on. So they had an extended, minus 20-some dollar pricing at almost all of the hubs inside of MISO for several days, right? So bad news if you invested in wind power, right? You were not making money or you were making negative money over those days, right? So this is still happening at large scale today is the point. Okay, what does it actually look like in detail from an individual generator's point of view? I just put a couple examples. This is recent data from January through April of this year, 2015. And this is the price history as seen by a single generation site. This is wind turbine 3007, wind farm 3007. It's one of the unit numbers inside the power grid. And a couple interesting things worth noting. First, I have the max and the min prices. So the max price per megawatt hour was $1,137. For comparison, the average price in the whole MISO market over the year is $32. So 30x, right? And the minimum price was minus $492.18. So gigantic negative variation. That's why this dynamic range looks so small, because the max and the min are so large. But there aren't very many of them, right? But even within this range, there's a fair amount of fluctuation. This might be $20. This might be minus $10 or $20. Yeah. That's right. So you have a running tab with the grid, right? And if you put input power into the grid at that time, you have to pay. Yeah. So now the theory, the economic theory, is that discourages you from generating power, right? But in practice, you have some technical limitations, right? Okay, so here's a finer grained picture of this. Let me just explain this. This one actually has the scale on it. This is a slightly different site for a couple of, these are hours. So this is the first, 10 or 20 days of January. And you can see a little bit more of the scale here. So here's 0, and this scale is 200. So this is, maybe $60 or $70, and going down to minus, for significant amounts of time. Yeah. 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 Well, I want to be careful. The pictures I'm showing you are not necessarily representative of all the sites, right? I'm just trying to show you the variation. So there are some sites that have much more regular pricing, right? And it really depends on their location in the grid, right? Okay. So here's a good example to show you how much stranded power this is. So this is a different plot. This plots, let's see, on the x-axis, how much the generator bid that it could generate in the next hour, right? And then the vertical axis is how much it was allowed to generate, right? That it was told, right? And then it adjusted its allotment to. And if it was always able to generate as much as it wanted, all the dots would be on this line. as you can see, a bunch of the time it was told, go away, don't generate anything, and a bunch of the time it was somewhere in the middle. Now, it's possible some of this is due to the fact that the wind generators didn't follow through and generate as much as they said they could, but that's actually a relatively rare phenomenon because the prediction is pretty good in these kinds of systems. So most of this is due to stranded power, right, being available. Okay, I think I'd better go a little faster. So now you have an intuitive notion what is stranded power. Let's try and model this a little bit more precisely. So our first model is instantaneous stranded power. That is power with no economic value. We'll define that as 0 or negative value, right, for a 5-minute interval, right? So I offer you something, you tell me, I'll take it, but you got to pay me, right? That's stranded power. So we define LMP0 as a model in which the locational market price is less than $0 per megawatt hour. Simple idea. And then we're going to have a bunch of families of these, LMP0, LMP1, LMP2, all the way through 5. And for comparison, 32 megawatts is the average for the MISO region. So LMP5 is still 6x lower than the average price. It's pretty cheap, right? Okay, and then what did we analyze? We analyzed basically 28 months of this large power market. We have a full set of records. It has 1,259 generation sites, of which 200 are wind. 5-minute intervals, 76.9 million records across all of these things. Apparently, there's more for wind. And there's the power, and there's approximate revenue that was covered. So pretty thorough analysis, right, in terms of the data in anyway. So if you analyze this, one question you might ask is, if I sit at any particular site, what is my duty factor for stranded power, right? How often, if I'm sitting at that site, do I see stranded power? So this is a histogram that shows the different sites. And you can see that for most of the sites, actually, they see stranded power less than 10% of the time. This is kind of what your intuition would expect. You're like, well, they do a reasonable job of allocating. It shouldn't be the case that there's stranded power all the time. There's a smaller number that have it 10 to 20%, and a much smaller number, maybe just a couple of them, 3 or 4, that have it between 20 and 30% of the time for the LMP0 market. And if you look at that with a variation of thresholds and numbers, adding numbers of sites, where the idea here is that I'm going to combine multiple sites, right? If I'm going to be clever, I'm going to either, use them somehow in coordination, or I'm going to amortize across multiple different sites. I could increase the duty factor. You can see as you go from LMP0 up to LMP5, the blue bar followed by the others, you can increase it slightly from 20-some% up to maybe 25%. And as you add sites, you can use the independent variation of these different sites to increase the availability of stranded power, right, up to some level, maybe 40-some-odd%. But at some point, you can't get up any further, right? And this kind of matches your intuition as well. There's some variation you can exploit, but at some point, right, there's just not excess, right? Okay. Now, if you look at this, you say, well, how usable is this power? These are the interval sizes for this LMP, different LMP models. And this is the fraction of the duty factor that corresponds to intervals that were 5 minutes, less than an hour, 10 hours, 100 hours, and so on. And as you'd expect, right, there's a slightly larger chunk for some of the larger times, but most of these intervals are pretty short. So you get 5 minutes, you get 10 minutes, and so on, right? So that's for the best single site for a bunch of different LMP models. So the first time we did the analysis, we looked at this and said, oh, we're kind of depressed. We had this cool idea. It doesn't look like this is going to be very easy to use, right? Okay. So then we got clever. We said, well, wait a minute. Maybe we're just not thinking about stranded power in the right way, because we've got this large dynamic variation. Maybe we need to think about it beyond 5 minutes. So we came up with the second stranded power model, and this model is based on NetPrice. So the idea is that you look at an interval and you say, what is the average price I got for power over that period? And it's a weighted average based on the actual generation. And if that average is below some number, we consider that whole region to be stranded power, because it would have been more beneficial for that provider to give the power to you at that price than to sell it to the grid, right? So this is, the idea is to smooth out these fluctuations, do something clever. Here's the formal definition of it. It's just what you think. It's the price times what you generated divided by what you generated, average price. And then there's a whole family of these models, NetPrice 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? By the way, this actually wasn't the second model. We actually tried 5 or 6 others. So you get a fast forward. So if you look at this metric I showed you before for NetPrice 0, this is wind sites with different duty factors. You now see that there's actually this long tail, right? So we have some down at 10%, but some of them all the way out here at 50, 60%, right, for net price zero. Yeah. This is based on, I think, 28 months of analysis.
No. I mean, but your smoothing factor is now a function of what you're summing over some period of time. Right?
Yes, that's right.
What's the window of the period of time that you're computing this?
Yeah, actually, it's a little bit arbitrary. So basically, we initiate an interval at the point at which the average price goes below the net price threshold. And then we continue it as long as we can, averaging over that interval. Right? So it's an eager or greedy approach to initiating these intervals. We could do a better analysis if we assumed an oracle and after the fact analyzed optimum intervals, but we're not doing that. This is just a greedy online kind of decision for that. Okay. So more interesting, right? If you look at this net price capability versus the number of sites, you see that for the first site, for net price zero, you got about 60%. That's what you saw in the previous graph. And as I increase this net price model, I actually can get quite high. I can actually get up to almost 80%. If I add a second one, I can increase that further. If I add a third site, I can increase that further. Actually, this first bar was actually 3 sites, but we determined that 3 sites were connected to the same point in the grid, and they had exactly the same pricing characteristics. So we merged them into one, just to be, not to cheat and add up the count. But it's interesting because you can also see that as you get up to higher and higher percentages, at some point you can't get any higher because, again, at some points the grid is fully utilized and there really is no stranded power, either because there isn't enough load to actually generate these sort of mismatches or there isn't enough wind power being generated to actually cause these kinds of overgeneration events. But this is much more encouraging, right? More interesting, if you actually flip and look at this interval question. So what is the distribution of contribution to this duty factor based on different interval sizes, again with the same bins? 5 minutes, less than an hour, 10 hours, and so on. This is by count, actually, right? So this is by count of intervals. You can see that there's actually a lot that are by count that are less than or equal to an hour, some that are less than or equal to 10, and so on. But more interesting is to not do this by count, but to do it by average contribution to the time. And then here, because these intervals that are between 10 and 100 hours are much longer, you see that actually the dominant contribution is from some very, very long intervals, right? So actually the distribution of this power is much better than you might guess even from the average kind of number, right? And as you change the net price, of course, the intervals get slightly longer. You see a slight shift to the higher numbers. So this is just for a single site. And is of similar characteristics for other sites, yeah. No, you don't. And if you did, you probably could make a lot of money off of the price markets, right? So I think there's a good argument that there's prediction, but that prediction is shared. And, well, some smart people might be able to figure out some prediction information about this, but we haven't tried yet. Now, how much power is this? I didn't say anything about quantity of power, but we recently wrote a paper and sent it to one of these parallel computing meetings. So to calibrate how much stranded power this is the number of sites across the bottom that we were using. Here's the amount of stranded power for net price 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the quantity, right? Average quantity over the intervals. And you can see that with just 7 of these sites, there's plenty of power that you could power the top 250 supercomputing systems in the world, about 300 petaflops of computing. With whatever 175 megawatts or something of power, right? So at least if you're in the computing world, there's a tremendous amount of power available, and this is not anywhere close to all of the stranded power in just that mid-continent region, right? Okay. So that's all I'm going to say about stranded power. Based on that idea, we've been trying to figure out different ways that one might use it. So the idea is that we like to create on-demand computational loads that can exploit this stranded power. I'm a computer scientist. I think about computing systems. So it's sort of a nice and natural way to go. Computing is easy to move around. Computing is easy to turn on and off, relatively speaking, compared to an aluminum smelting plant or a petroleum cracking, oil cracking plant or something like that. The idea is to reduce grid waste, but it also appears that you can use these dispatchable loads to increase grid stability, right? And that grid stability is actually an important challenge these days. Of course, you're going to encourage the development of renewable resources by increasing financial return for renewable resources. And with that increasing grid stability, you may be providing a means to achieve higher RPS, renewable portfolio fraction, or renewable portfolio standards for the for the grid, because if you have too much variability with no way of compensating for that, you may not be able to achieve very, very high RPS goals like California just adopted. And of course, the goal is to lower grid costs always. So I'm going to talk about two different things that we've been trying to do. Actually, I'm just going to mention spot instances because that's an obvious thing to a computer science community. And then I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about this high-performance computing study that we've done. So everyone has used the cloud. Has everyone in this room used the cloud? Right? EC2? Yeah? Okay. So cloud services are a natural thing. So here's the conceptual notion. You take a bunch of these containers, you drop them down under wind farms. Actually, since I drew this picture, I discovered that you don't actually need to disperse them underneath the wind turbines. In most of these wind farms, they actually have all of the turbines connected in a big wired OR configuration. So what it means is that you can actually just put them all under one and it'll work just fine, right? And it'll draw from all of them. But the idea is you start on demand when there's stranded power, and otherwise you don't run, right? That's the model. You consume the power continuously while it's available, and then you shut down gracefully when the power is no longer available, and you do something good about the service, right? That's the idea. So it turns out that that matches any kind of preemptible or eviction model, right, such as you have with spot instances, where you can execute a virtual machine or container at a time. The bidding is just sort of a frill of this feature, but the fundamental model, which is eviction, right, is something that makes sense. So here you have a model in which you have start time and end time dictated by the system. That's the key abstraction. And then you can have a queue of persistent requests and new spot requests. So you can queue things up basically, right? So this is one possible model, and we've done some economic analysis of this kind of model. It looks like if you only support spot instances, that you can actually pay for these kinds of systems, but the payback is right at the edge of what might actually be economically viable. However, we all know there's a big gap between spot instance pricing and on-demand instance pricing and long-term. So there's a lot of headroom in there of established market where you could do innovative computer science, right, to actually make these things more valuable, right? So that's one possibility. A second possibility is high-performance computing, because high-performance computing is this other world in which you pre-queue work, and the system decides when your work begins and when it ends. So this kind of decoupling is actually really valuable in this kind of a unpredictable intermittent resource. So the usual way of operating in these large batch schedule systems, and it turns out places like Google and Facebook and these other places also use these kinds of queuing systems for in-depth analysis, offline kinds of computations. You submit a bunch of large parallel computations into a batch scheduler. The batch scheduler monitors these parallel resources. It dictates the start and the end time, and it does a very complicated bin packing kind of solution in order to decide when your system runs, where it runs, and so on. But the most important thing is it does that bin packing based on a queue of new parallel job requests that are all sitting in the queue and some kind of forward-going plan of the resource, right? So that's the model. So we've done a bunch of studies of this, and we decided actually that a good way to frame this is the following. If you look at a traditional data center or a traditional supercomputing center, it lives within some kind of physical envelope. It has a certain amount of power that comes into that facility. It may have a certain amount of cooling that extracts heat from that facility and a certain physical size. And of course, there may be constraints actually on how much carbon you can actually emit, as you can see, right, by companies trying to cover their tracks, if you will, by entering into long-term purchase agreements for wind power, co-locating next to volcanoes. I think that's what Facebook did in Iceland, and so on. So get geothermal energy. So the point is that there are very real limits around facilities like this that limit their expansion. And in the supercomputing world, generally speaking, the government or large institutions are having to eat these very significant costs and how to get around these limits. So the idea that I'm going to explore here is that you take a supercomputer that I work in close proximity to at Argonne, Mira, which is one of the world's largest computers. It's a 10 petaflop machine. It's about, I think it's number 5 in the world, so it's one of the biggest supercomputers in the world, that lives within one of these fixed envelopes. And in the next generation, hypothetically, expand the system with a ZCCloud resource that sits underneath one of these variable generators. And ZCCloud stands for the name Zero Carbon Cloud, which is the idea we're trying to run this stuff off of carbon-free power, right? So we're going to model a second system of roughly the same size, and in some cases 2 and 3 times the size. Okay, so this is projected as a potential expansion model for these supercomputers. So the first question you might ask, if you were going to buy one of these things, get out your checkbook, is what am I going to get? Can I actually operate this thing and get any benefits? So we did a study using real workload traces from the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility, 1 full year of traces, all of the jobs run on the system, so we're not hiding anything, on this number 5 supercomputer in the world. There were 78,795 jobs. They ranged in runtime from, I don't know how many seconds that is, 4,000 7-hour to 82 hours. Average runtime was 1.7 hours. And they range the number of nodes, right? 16 cores per node, right? From 1 to 48K, which is the full machine, and averaged about 2,000 nodes, or about 32,000 cores. So a lot of big jobs, right? Okay, so how well does it work? Well, it's pretty complicated to understand the behavior of this intermittent parallel resource. So we started with a slightly simpler model, and we said, first we want to understand how adding intermittent resources affect the performance of these kinds of workloads. So the first thing we did was we put a hypothetical intermittent resource next to Mira, and we said it comes on once every 24 hours for 50% of the time, so a 12-hour run, and then it goes away. Right? So it's predictable, and then we compared its performance. So this is the average wait time, right, in the queue, which is a good sort of predictive behavior. It's a good performance metric for how long users have to wait. If we take that 1x workload and we run it on Mira, we had an average wait time of about 4 hours. If you take that 1x workload and you run it on this Mira ZCCloud system, lo and behold, the average wait time goes down to less than, well, below an hour, right? But of course, right, the clever observer in the audience will say, well, that's not fair. You increased the number of resources dramatically, right? So the average wait time went way down, right? That's right, it went way down, and we increased the resources by about 50%, right? So then the next thing we did was we ran this thing again, scaling up the workload and the total number of core hours required by 50%. And we said, well, how does it do? And it turns out that on that same resource, balance to that resource, it still gives a significant benefit, right, in reduced wait time. Okay. Now, this scaled up workload was just 50% larger average over the whole 24-hour period, right? We also wanted to see whether the shape of the workload made any difference. So we had another workload, which was a burst workload. What's a burst workload? Well, it's 1x for the first 12 hours, and then it goes to 2x for the second 12 hours. So it matches the shape of the resource. And that turned out to not help very much, just a little bit, right? Yeah. Did we scale up the duration or we scale up the core count? We scaled neither. We scaled just the number of jobs. Yeah, and the reason for that has to do with the technical limitation of how the scheduler works, right? So the scheduler inside of BlueJean actually understands the topology of the machine, right? We didn't think it was fair to actually presume that the topology of the machine was preserved over this larger structure, right? Because you would have to have a huge amount of bisection bandwidth. So we actually only ran jobs with a maximum size of 768,000 cores. So we just scaled the number of jobs, right? So you're not seeing coupling across those two domains. You're seeing two separate domains being scheduled from one. That's right. That's right. Okay. So even better than the basic capacity increase, and the shape doesn't matter. Right? That was the first thing we learned. Same experiment again in terms of resources, just looking at the effect on the jobs. And it turns out that you're getting actually a very, very big benefit for these large jobs, right? 32,000 to 48K nodes, and a smaller benefit down here. The benefit is weighted heavily to these high capability jobs. And it turns out that the reason for that is that the machine gets cleared at the end of the 12-hour big machine interval, right? And that clearing effect actually seems to be what is accounting for most of the benefit in the reduced wait time for the big jobs. So maybe this is a good way to actually manage a system even if you don't have ZCCloud, is to periodically just flush all the jobs. But I leave that for other folks to think about. How am I doing on time? Okay. So in analyzing the results, it turned out, right, that there was a characteristic that was an important differentiator in whether a job benefited or not from this new additional resource. So here was the overall benefit for all jobs. You saw that data before. And then we divided into two kinds of jobs called on-time jobs and late jobs. So what are on-time jobs? Well, it's just what you'd expect. A job that arrived while you had this additional resource, and its runtime was such that it could finish before the end of that additional resource being available. So you arrived in time or on time, right? And the late jobs were the unfortunate ones that arrived either too late or when there was no additional resource, right? And so how did it affect their performance? So the late jobs, don't benefit directly, but they benefit from the clearing effect of more of the other jobs going through during the ZCCloud time, and you can see the difference here very clearly. So this means that if you wanted to actually classify your jobs and figure out, how to schedule based on this kind of variation, there's a very straightforward way of doing this, right? Okay. So none of this had stranded power yet, right? So then the next thing we did is we combined together these very complicated interval distributions, right, from the stranded power system, and then we ran the mirror scheduler, right, and we went to see what happened, right? So this is the performance by stranded power model of the base system, of the LMP0, right? So I'm bringing back the other stranded power models, LMP0 and LMP5, NetPrice 0 and NetPrice 5 systems, right? And this is the average latency. And each of the three bars is the 1x workload, 1.25x workload, and 1.5x workload. So in some sense, the 1.5x one is the fairest one. As you can see, for the LMP0 and the LMP5 systems, we couldn't complete the 1.5x workload. There isn't enough duty factor, right? And so on. So the LMP things are actually not very productive, not very workable. The net price has a higher duty factor and provides growing benefit as you increase the value. So let's dive in a little deeper on that. So this chart compares the periodic simple resource, right, with 21% duty factor, 24%, 60%, and 80%. I picked the funny numbers in order to match, I should say my student picked the funny numbers in order to match the actual duty factor you could get out of these models. And you can see that the periodic model is more productive at the same duty factor for these low duty factor systems. As you increase the duty factor, as net price allows you to get the higher duty factors, the gap perhaps narrows a bit. And very interestingly to us, in the end case here, or the most aggressive case, the net price system is actually outperforming, right, the periodic system at the same duty factor. And at first we thought, why is that? How could it be better? And then we realized what's going on. The stranded power system has a better interval distribution than the periodic system, because the periodic system has a maximum of 80% of 24 hours. That means within every 24-hour period, you lose that resource. Whereas, as you saw from the distribution, the net price 5 has some durations in excess of 100 hours, a whole bunch of durations in 10 to 100 hours, so many of those could exceed. So we actually have a better conditioned resource than the periodic resource, right? So that explains, at least for us, what's going on here. Okay, so I don't have time to talk about the many dimensions of related work, but there's lots of different things that tie into this that I'll just say a few things about. The first is there's a huge amount of work looking at integration of renewables into the power grid and doing lots of things to make it possible actually to integrate these variable resources. In some sense, that's the existential challenge, right, for how you make green electric power happen. And that includes NREL's Wind Vision report, a whole bunch of studies on grid expansion and power markets. And that really is an integral part of the problem we're trying to solve. The second major area of related work is there's been a huge amount of wonderful work, actually a bunch of it here at the IEE, on energy efficiency in data centers, looking at power distribution, looking at more efficient communication, looking at dynamic management. Of course, Urs Hosla and Luis Barroso, Urs as an alumnus of UCSB, at least as an alumnus as a faculty member, published some famous papers on energy proportional computing, drowsy P-state management, and all kinds of things. Drowsy switches and so on have been a large area. This is really different from what we're trying to do. It's a good thing to do, but they're on the load end side of the grid, so they're doing conservation, right? So it's quite a different thing. More closely related is there's recently been a lot of interest in the cloud companies in doing solar augmentation, that is local site solar, and then signing long-term purchase contracts for wind or co-location. And I guess this is going to be persisted on the web, but I'm going to say something that's a little bit provocative here. While these things are good things generally to do in terms of stimulating renewable investment and so on, it's actually really unclear whether long-term they're actually a good idea and whether they do any good with respect to creating a stable, renewable-dominated grid, which is what we believe we're all going to. And the basic problem is if you look at the properties that they create for the load in the data center on the power grid, is they create covariation with renewables in the grid. right? So that means that if I have local solar panels, right, and I have a lot of solar out in California, right, when the sun is shining on my data center, I'm reducing my load to the grid. At the same time, when the grid is getting more resources from the rest of all that solar. So the geographic, correlation means that you're actually creating counter variation of load, which is bad. You're making the grid's job harder, right? So there's a lot of evidence to suggest this is not a good thing to do and actually counterproductive. The interesting thing about the long-term purchase agreements is if you actually dig down into them, not 1 joule of energy that comes from the wind farm actually goes directly to the data centers. It's kind of a carbon footprint kind of game where you buy trees in order to offset your flight to Brazil or wherever it is you went, right? And there is no direct connection. Now, there is this interesting idea that's been proposed called follow the sun, which is to build a network of data centers and to shift your computing load around to where the sun is, and then use the one that's closest to you. This is actually a good idea, right, with respect to these kinds of properties we're talking about, but quite difficult to reconcile with, time response, kinds of user interaction kinds of things that many of the cloud companies are trying to achieve, and is also likely to give you a relatively low equipment utilization factor, which is an important challenge, right? The sun shines maybe 12 hours a day on average. Depends on where you live. So really what we're trying to do with ZCCloud is to demonstrate that it's possible actually to build large quantities of these volatile resources and then ask the question, how much of computing can we shift into a deferrable or dispatchable model, right, and therefore into this kind of green power. So I've got a summary and a couple foregoing things that I can just put up to be provocative. But I wanted to say stranded power is a growing challenge for renewables, and it looks like it's going to increase dramatically in the future. There's many kinds of dispatchable loads, but computational dispatchable loads are particularly interesting because ICT is a huge and growing part of overall power consumption. It's several percent today and one of the largest growing parts. So it's important to try and address its impact on this grid, and it benefits both the grids and the renewable generators. We're trying to do a cloud services evaluation. We have an initial economic evaluation. I apologize, that's one of the casualties of cutting down my talk. I didn't actually talk about that, but Rich or I can tell you about that later if you want. And for the high performance computing system evaluation, the first interesting thing is I think that we've been able to show that intermittent resources can be gracefully integrated. Right? We had no change to the workload, we had no change to the fundamental scheduling model, and we're actually able to get benefit from it. And that the particular stranded power models that you use are important because they have a big impact on how much benefit you get. And in some cases, the benefit can be even greater than a periodic sort of regular kind of intermittent resource. There's lots of interesting questions, right? I intentionally titled this talk to be a little bit open-ended. Opportunities for exploiting stranded power. There's a whole range of uses that are not computing-oriented that are potentially interesting. There's all kinds of optimization that can be done, by combining sites, doing intelligent migration, those kinds of things that could allow you to build a more reliable, valuable cloud service. I think I tried to touch on this, but one of the things to understand is that building dispatchable loads for the grid may actually be beneficial to the grid in ways that have nothing to do with the utility you get from those loads. We have fundamental challenges in stability for these grids. And if you can increase the stability and the predictability of the loads, or better yet, give the grid a dispatchable load, then it may be able to operate with the reduced operating margin, which is sort of like a constant overhead for regulation and power stability, right, that they pay all the time, right? You may have an increased ability to exploit other renewable power. You can allow more variation and dynamic range, again, if you have control of these loads. You may be able to do partial load shifting from one time to another, right, in order to make ends meet in the instantaneous requirement of the grid. So maybe with that, I have more materials on all of this, like where we're going with higher RPS, how you can actually affect the economics of the grid by adding these dispatchable loads and so on. But let me stop at this point, and if folks have questions about that, I can speak to those things.
Questions for Andrew? And I should say his slides are going to be online in about a week.
Internet speed, 1 week, huh? Yes?
Isn't there an infrastructure change that you proposed here?
Yeah.
Show the slide, like dropping a server farm and
So the example I showed was that you would put it, all the simulation reflects the assumption you put it in one site. But you pick that site very carefully because it's the highest yield site, right? And then, if you wanted to go further, you might pick another site, right? But it looks like, so it was not obvious to us when we started whether it made sense to pick one site or multiple or whatever. It turns out that one site is strictly better than the second site. So I would pick one site and I would put all of it there, right? Only if you have some continuity requirement would you begin to go to other sites, I think. That's the way it looks to us right now. That's true. 80% with the NetPrice 5 model. Yeah. And so the other question you might ask is there enough power at one site, right? And the answer is they had 30 megawatts average, so a fair amount of power, of stranded power. So it's actually amazing, right? Some of these wind farms are 300, 400 megawatts, so 30 to them is like, oh yeah, there's a mechanical problem on a couple of the turbines, It's an interesting scale perspective. Other questions?